The house you see on the screen there, I visited it last year. It's home to a Roma family, a woman and her 6 children. And there's 2 of her kids on the screen. And what I remember most of all from visiting her family that afternoon was that when I went in, and the inside is no better than the outside, to be perfectly frank, she kept apologizing. She apologized for the poor conditions, for the poor furniture, for the poor facilities, for what she said were her own poor clothes and those of her children. She apologized. And at a certain point, I found myself getting very upset, because I had such a strong sense that this woman has no business apologizing to anybody. We owe her an apology. We have failed her. And of course, here in Europe, one of our great stains as a continent is our failure to support the human rights of our, if we count just in the EU, 6 million Roma brothers and sisters. Why have we failed them so very badly in terms of delivering on their basic human rights? There are many reasons. It's very, very wide-ranging. But one of them, just one, but nevertheless an important one, is that we have failed in communication. We have failed to transmit in a meaningful way messages to 3 communities. The first community, of course, is the community of policymakers, lawmakers, decision makers in our societies. We know that we would have succeeded if they made better policy, better law, took better actions for the Roma. We failed them. A second community that we have failed to convince with our messages is the Roma community itself. We've not succeeded in galvanizing the Roma community to shout out for its own human rights, at least to the extent and at the volume level that's needed. And the third failure is probably the most worrying one of all 3, which is that we have failed to convince our own general populations that the situation of Roma is arguably Europe's greatest scandal, and that it should be getting us out on the streets in the way that the climate change action has brought people on the streets in recent weeks. So three communication failures, which have at least in part contributed to families living in such deplorable conditions. Friso described to you just now how we at the Fundamental Rights Agency are very concerned about the need to do a better job of communicating, and repeated instances such as that of this family reinforce for all of us how very important it is right now to take stock and to address how we can do a much better job of communicating our messages. Now, why is this a particularly timely moment? It actually surprisingly is. There's a convergence of elements in play here. It's not just that we've all just noticed that we're bad communicators of our human rights messages, but perhaps almost inevitably we're in that moment in history when that questioning would necessarily arise. Here's a very familiar picture. We all look at it and we're moved by it. We tweet it every 10th of December. But actually, if you look at it with fresh eyes, it's a very old picture. It's an ancient picture. Was there anybody in this room born when that picture was taken? I don't think so. It's a reminder to us that the human rights system on which we base our arguments is a kind of a dated one. It was designed in the 1940s. And we act as if somehow fit for purpose in 1948 is fit for purpose in 2019. And we have to interrogate such challenges. What are the changes? For instance, what motivated all of those people to establish this system, such as the Holocaust and the other genocides of the Second World War, is hardly remembered by any living person left on Earth. Nearly everybody now is dead. And certainly all the negotiators of the system are dead. So those people with that first-hand appalled experience of the absolute atrocities of the Second World War are no longer here to remind us and to remind our societies of why the human rights system is so central to the future of our civilization. Side by side with the death of the designers of the system, we also have fundamental changes in society which challenge the models of law and the ways in which we present such models to make a difference today. For example, we have the decline of authority. it was the case at a certain point in history that there was an expectation when you say do it because it's a rule, that it'll get done. Or at least if it doesn't get done, the person realizes that they're violating a rule or a norm. That isn't a core value in our societies anymore. I'm not saying that's good or bad, it's just a fact that the simple claim to authority, which is what we so often relied on in the past for human rights, is simply not going to work in the same way now as it would in the past. So very closely related to the decline of authority is, of course, the shifts in our society triggered by digitalization. Now, you know more about it than I do, and I'm not going to go on about it. I'm just going to use the digital world to recall the extent to which the way we work, the way we interact, even the notions of transnationality are so transformed with the digitalization of just about every aspect of our lives. And two more of the 6 considerations I'd give as to why we need to take stock now. This is the moment in history when we must take stock. Are, for example, the extent to which, on top of all the problems I've just laid out, that we've lost the goodwill and the support, the partnership of our general populations. We have focused so closely, and arguably so necessarily, on the plight of those on the edges that we have often forgotten the human rights of the people who live next door. And so, at a certain point, we lost them. Human rights was no longer about us, but it's about them being remote people living on the edges of our society. Now, again here, I want to be careful. I'm not suggesting we disregard the edges. That will be the test of the quality and sincerity of our work. But we have to ask, are we doing it at the expense of those people at the heart of our societies, the so-called general population? And final of my 6 elements of the analysis of where we are today, of course, feeds on many of the points I've just made, and that is the rise of populism. And again, I don't need to say much about that other than to mention the extent to which it is a corrosion, a woodworm eating away from inside at the fabric of all the decent bits of our societies, including support for the protection of human rights. So all of that is a context for the recent work that Friso has already explained to you, the recent work of this agency. We're just one small part of the human rights community, but we've been doing our best to make a meaningful contribution to redressing the crisis of communications that afflicts so many of us. Friso has mentioned the headline works of the agency. We established the Communicators Network. We are committed to continue to support it to the extent that its participants want to be supported. And we produced, among other things, this 10 Keys document that I guess, if you don't have it already, there are so many copies of it to take away from outside that you'll see it before the end of the day. Now, we expect and hope that you will interrogate the 10 Keys in the course of our proceedings today and tomorrow. But before you say it for us, let me just say it on our behalf. And that is, there is nothing new in the 10 Keys. Not one single original idea. I'm proud of that. Why am I proud of that? Because all of the lessons of effective communication have been known for a very long time. The problem was drawing them together, putting them in a single place so that we can meaningfully engage with them. This is a picture of the Upper Basilica of St. Francis in Assisi. It's up there because around the walls of the basilica you have the famous cycle of frescoes by Giotto, the life of St. Francis, painted in the 14th century. Giotto took 14 moments in Francis' life and then immortalized them in the fresco cycle. That, from 700 years ago? That from nearly 700 years ago remains a profound message of effective communication. If you go to Assisi today, and I was there during the summer, you will see Franciscan friars walking around the church telling the story of Francis using 700-year-old frescoes. That's what I mean when I say there's nothing new under the sun, but it is useful to get it all into one single place. Now you're going to look at the keys, you're going to look at all different angles of them. I just want to gratuitously share with you what is my current favorite of the keys. And that is the one, I don't remember what number it is, but it's the one that reminds us that we've got to seek new voices, new messengers for our messages. That maybe we're relying on ourselves too much and not enough on all of the alternative voices that are far more likely to be listened to. I'm particularly excited every time I test this out in terms of working with the arts community. I never cease to be appalled and amazed at how much better they are than me at transmitting fundamental human rights messages. Friso and myself had the great pleasure of being given a guided tour just a few months ago of the building you see up there in the image. That's what is colloquially called the Africa Museum in Brussels. It's the repository of the loot of King Leopold, wasn't it? King Leopold of Belgium, who ransacked the Congo for treasure after treasure well over 100 years ago. And the material lay languishing in an almost forgotten museum until just a few years ago, when a museum genius called Guido Grisels was offered the directorship, and he recurated every object in his museum in a way that would tell a story of respect and dignity of the people being spoken about, but also telling fundamental tales of human rights. And if any of you have been there, you'll know, as certainly was the experience of Friso and myself, that we learned more that afternoon about human rights than you would out of many a long day in a university classroom. And so for me then, at the moment, the powerful capacity of the arts to tell our stories is very striking. Now, there are only 10 keys in the little book. And another thing we want you to do is help us find additional keys, at least the 11th and the 12th. I look forward to hearing what you might suggest could be the 11th and the 12th. We're already talking about number 11 and number 12 in-house. And if I could just mention them, number 11, getting my vote, would be the key of making the business case for our claims. I spoke earlier about how a simple reliance on authority isn't going to work anymore. We have to not just rely on authority, but we have to persuade. We have to demonstrate that our way is the better way. It leads to the better, the stronger, the more sustainable social outcome. That's core to human rights, not just messaging, but I think it would be a valid claimant for the 11th key. And the 12th key, which I love because it's counterintuitive, is that in order to be better communicators, we really have to learn to be better listeners. We're bad listeners, I find, in the human rights world. We're so filled with the certainty of our claims and our demands that we don't sit down long enough to listen to somebody who we claim as almost being the enemy, as opposed to the potential partner. And so it's something I certainly have to work on. I'm a bad listener, as anybody who works here will tell you. But it has to be integral to our message deliverance if we're to be serious going forward. And finally, call it the 13th key if you will, but I don't want to give it such a number because it's quite a personal thing. But there is a 13th key emerging for me. And it's the key of getting personal with our messages. And I don't think it can be presented as something we must all do, because by definition, if it's personal, it's intimate. And only you, me, only we can make our own personal choices as to how we want to use our own identity as part of the telling of our story. But I've found that I've found on reflection that I tend to live my life too much carved up into tidy little boxes. And the boxes don't necessarily engage with each other. So when I'm doing my human rights work, I operate out of one box. But then when I remember what I've done in the past, that's in another box. But it should be the same box. So I have increasingly, in recent times, been using my own experience, my own story, as part of my messages. And I'm surprised how reluctant I was to do it. This is me in 1993 in Sarajevo. And in the first place, I'm taken aback by how reluctant I was to do it. And on the other hand, I'm surprised and impressed by how effective it is when I do it. It sometimes gives an authority, a credibility, a relevance that I wouldn't have if I didn't draw on those memories. And there's a room full of memories here. And I wonder, are we using them enough as we tell our stories? The second dimension of using ourselves more, getting out of our little boxes, for me also has been not just telling stories of my past, but telling stories of my identity. And again, I've only done this recently, and it's not easy. But for example, I'm gay, and I've started to say that in speeches. Never said it before. I always said, it's irrelevant, who cares? But it gives me an authority that I wouldn't have if I didn't say it in a certain context. And the hardest one of all is just, I turned 60 a couple of months ago, and you think it's hard to come out with your sexual orientation? It's way harder to come out with your age. But I did it. I did it in a little video clip a few months ago. And here in the office, we're really quite taken aback by the impact it's had. I mean, we've had a dozen invitations to come to older people's conferences to speak about this issue. I see an unexpected future unfolding for myself. But look, I would just invite you, to the extent you find it interesting, just do a little examination of to what extent your own identity, your own story could be put to better use to give you an authority in your messaging. Now, let me wrap up with a little story. This picture was taken at a place called Pavey Point in Dublin just a couple of months ago, where Nicole, my colleague, where's Nicole? She's in the room. So there you are. You're right in front of me. Nicole and myself spent an amazing morning at Pavey Point. Pavey Point is the Roma and Travellers Community Centre in Dublin. They gave us 4 hours of their time. And what happened? Well, in the first place, they met us in the full range of their identities. There were Roma there were travellers there, men and women, young and old. They engaged with us through words, through text, through song, through performance, through crafts. There was some laughter that morning. There were some tears. There was anger and there was passion. And there was so much more else. And Nicole and I think, would both agree that we came away at noon on that day knowing more about, feeling more for the traveller and Roma community than I think had ever been our experience beforehand in our lives. And why am I telling you that now? I'm telling you that because I think Nicole and I were privileged that morning to receive from this Roma and traveller community a masterclass in communication. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael, for these inspiring words. All three speakers have agreed to take questions from you after their presentation. So the first opportunity is right now. If you have anything you want to put to Michael or any comment you want to make, please let us know now. Yeah, and if you could just briefly introduce yourself.
I'm Tim Parrott. I work with Oak Foundation and the International Human Rights Program. It was just the question about authority. I just wondered if you could say a few words more about that. Is that a sort of governmental authority or a social authority? Yeah.
Yeah, Michael, if you could
Yeah.
back in the fishbowl.
Okay, I'm fine here.
Because then you can be...
All right. I'll stay over here then. Yeah, look, I'm not a political scientist, so I don't have any huge, unique insight into this. It's just that we find in our work that it's no longer adequate to claim a rule base to get compliance. More seems to be needed, whereas that hasn't always been the case. There was a greater respect for authority, order, instruction, even up to 20, 25 years ago. So to the extent we could ever rely on just issuing the instruction to bring about the change, that's not going to work anymore. And that's why I introduced the later point about making the business case, of going the extra mile, of doing the research, gathering the evidence to demonstrate that what you're seeking to have happen will lead to a better social outcome.
Any other question or comments from any of you?
Hello, my name is Sarah Newford and I'm from UNHCR. I just want to make a comment on the piece around identity. It's funny that we often look at our persons of concern to speak about the experience, but what you say, Michael, about using your own identity, your own experiences to infuse what you communicate is a really thought-provoking and idea. I'd never thought of it before, but thank you for that.
Okay. Thank you, Phil.
Phil Lynch from the International Service for Human Rights. Thanks for a great presentation. I'm interested in the idea of the importance of making the business case, which I think was probably orthodoxy maybe 10 or 15 years ago, but my sense of the conversation is that there's some scepticism about that claim now, and that by making the business case, what we're doing is framing the debate in terms which are not necessarily conducive to the values with which we want to frame the debate. And so I'm really intrigued as to why you seem to have come full circle on this, and why we would want to debate issues where we have values that can trump in economic terms.
Phil, I always come late to a fashion. Most others have moved on by the time I even notice it, so maybe this is another case of it. Maybe what I need to do is just be more clear on my terms. I'm not talking about making an economic argument for everything. Often we can't make an economic argument. We can't demonstrate that society will be richer if it does this or it does that. But we can always, and if we can't make this, what's the point? We can make a case society will be happier, society will be safer, society will be more equitable, and so on and so forth. That's what I mean by when I say business case, it's the full breadth of those types of issue that I have in mind. I couldn't agree with you more, that it must never become a trade-off of diminishing, of selling out on values and on legal obligations.
We have one final question.
Thank you. Katharina Bamberg, European Policy Center. Thank you very much for your talk, which I found very good and very inspiring. I do have one question about your 12th key, be better listeners, because I have heard that before, of course. And now I'm just wondering whether you could talk a bit more about that, and whether you have some practical ideas of how we can be better listeners.
Yeah. Touches on something else I'm going on about at the moment, which is to deepen our capacity for empathy, to be more effective, to put ourselves in the chair of the other person, in the shoes of the other person, in order to take action that affects the other person. You can only be empathetic, I think, after you've done some really active listening, so that you not only hear what the other person is saying, but you hear through it to what they're really saying, which can take a long time. I also know that when we make that effort, and it's rather rare, we build a relationship with the other which is more conducive to leading to the desired outcome. And that's pretty much what I mean. We have to be very careful, and I hope you don't mind me using the human rights gang, if you don't mind my tarring you with the same brush that I'm tarring myself. But we've too often kind of come into town riding a white horse, saying we have the righteousness with us, and now here we're giving it to you. Take it and be grateful. There's an awful lot of people out there, people of goodwill, decent people, who don't get human rights, but who get the desire to build better societies. And we just have to sit and invest the hours and the days listening and understanding, so we can build up the possibility for real communication with them.